PCOS is one of the most commonly diagnosed hormonal imbalance issues for women around the world. But despite its prevalence, there's a pretty significant lack when it comes to really reasonable treatment options. We know a lot of the symptoms tied with PCOS, things like irregular cycle, irregular periods, irregular ovulation, maybe difficulty conceiving, male pattern hair growth sorts of things, facial hair on women, and then also most commonly weight gain. But despite kind of knowing the on-flow effects of the condition of PCOS, the treatment options is pretty much limited to oral contraceptive pill and maybe some metformin. And part of the reason for this lack of really decent treatment options when it comes to this really common condition is that there's actually quite a lack of consensus in what actually constitutes a PCOS diagnosis. There's been disagreement in the kind of diagnosis of this for quite some time. And I think that really comes from a lack of understanding of the driving force of it. They're really looking at the result and trying to diagnose based on that rather than what's actually driving the condition in the first place. So today we're going to explore this a little bit more. If you have a diagnosis of PCOS, this might interest you. If you know someone with PCOS, this may interest you. But let's dig into this a little bit more. So I'm Mandy, I'm the clinical nutritionist at the Body Reset program, and we see a number of clients because it is relatively common. And really what we're dealing with are more of those on-flowing symptoms, the weight gain and those sorts of things that occur as a result of this condition. So let's break this down a little bit. PCOS is actually not a condition in the sense of, like an endometriosis diagnosis or a Hashimoto's diagnosis. PCOS is actually an umbrella term for a bunch of different phenomena that are occurring in the female body at this time. Now, the first one of these is high levels of androgens, which are male hormones. So we all produce some androgens, and that's a good thing. But when the levels are too high compared to our other hormones, this does create some issues. So that's the number one kind of defining feature of PCOS is high male hormone levels. As a result of that, there's very commonly irregular periods or missed ovulation. So this is kind of another defining feature of PCOS, which leads to the things, difficulty conceiving and very long menstrual cycles, etc. And then there's another component, and this is the one that's really kind of been conflated out of proportion and is really linked, and it's even in the name of PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, is the so-called cysts in the ovaries. Now, let's just talk about that for a minute. So they're not actually cysts at all. They are follicles, which would develop into eggs, which would be ovulated at ovulation time. And at any point in time, a female will have more or less potentially of those. So it's very common for females as they go through puberty and up until about the age of 20 to have more follicles than normal. If you have been on the oral contraceptive pill and then come off, it's very common transiently to have more follicles than normal. And just for various reasons, these do change throughout our lifetime, throughout the months. And so if, anyone gets an ultrasound on their ovaries, you may see more follicles than normal, and it doesn't necessarily mean they have PCOS at all. So it's possible to have more follicles there if you have PCOS, but it's also possible to have PCOS without having more follicles there. And it's possible to have more follicles there and not have PCOS at all. So this is where a lot of the confusion lies, is that a lot of times PCOS has been diagnosed by an ultrasound, and it's actually not possible to diagnose PCOS by an ultrasound alone, because the real component of PCOS is actually high androgens, high male hormones. So if we think about this in the sense of the male hormones, let's just get away from the cystic ovary kind of piece of it for a minute and think about the hormones. If we think about this in the context of high male hormones, we can see why the treatment then becomes the oral contraceptive pill, because it's able to turn down those hormones, balance things out, and deal with the hormonal symptoms. But what it's really not addressing is the driver. Now, what we know is that hormones are never the problem. Hormones are only ever responding to their environment. In a female body who has PCOS and she has the high androgen levels, we want to know why those levels are elevated in the first place, leading to all the other symptoms that occur as a result. So simply kind of dampening down the hormones through the use of contraceptive pill, while it may be useful in the fact that it's a treatment option and it provides some relief in some sense, it's not really getting at the root cause. So that kind of, and I think this is part of the issue with the PCOS, is that we've sort of left it at that. Like, well, that's what occurs, so this is what we'll do, and then we just leave it at that. But if we dig a little bit deeper and we actually want to know, well, why is it happening in the first place? What is the environment in my body that's creating this increased level of male hormones? We come to about 4 different drivers of this when it comes to PCOS. And I'm going to go through these in backwards order from the least common to the most common. So the least common is actually adrenal PCOS. So this is when there's actually an imbalance or a dysregulation in the adrenal hormone production, which stimulates an increase in the male hormone productions. This is pretty rare. It's maybe around about 10% of PCOS cases fall into this category. The next one is inflammatory PCOS, and this is often driven by inflammation from somewhere else. So often it's gut-based inflammation, maybe IBS or IBD, or irritable bowel issues, autoimmune conditions, so inflammatory conditions like that, or maybe even potentially skin issues, etc. But these high levels of inflammation in the body can then upset things to the degree where extra male hormones are produced, and that kind of flows on to all of the effects that occur as a result of that. This one as well, not super common, though it absolutely does occur. The next most common is actually post-pill PCOS. So this is PCOS that occurs, it's more transient, it occurs coming off the contraceptive pill. So the contraceptive pill has been suppressing the hormones, and once you come off it, there's kind of like an overcompensation with the hormones, which can lead to, an exacerbation, is that a word? At higher levels of those hormones being produced, and it's probably more likely as well that we might see that increased number of follicles in the ovaries at this time. This is often transient. It's something that may be a year or two out, might not be there anymore. So if you have had a PCOS diagnosis, a good point is actually to get it checked, because it is something that can come and go, because it's an umbrella term of a bunch of symptoms. As the symptoms change, as the environment changes, it's possible that that's actually no longer relevant for you, because it's not exactly a diagnosis of a sort of set condition. It's very movable. But the main driver of the high male hormones that are, really kind of the piece of PCOS that we're really talking about is insulin resistance. And this is the piece where I really want to talk about, because this is the piece that we can really have a huge impact on with nutrition and lifestyle stuff if we understand that it's a key component. So high insulin levels in the body, the ovaries tend to resist becoming insulin resistant. So they stay sensitive to high levels of insulin, and high levels of insulin in the ovaries tends to increase production of testosterone. So this is where we get these really high levels of testosterone being produced while the rest of the body is insulin resistant. That leads to weight gain and those other kind of metabolic issues that can arise as a result. So taking a contraceptive pill, which is the commonly prescribed kind of treatment for PCOS management, isn't really helping this issue. It's suppressing the hormones, but it's not really dealing with the fact that the insulin's the actual problem. So let's just talk about insulin resistance for a minute, just so that we're really clear on what's going on here. So insulin resistance is when the tissue in the body is no longer responding to the hormone insulin. The role of the hormone insulin is to open up the gates so that glucose from the food we eat can get into our cells and be burned as energy. And it also kind of regulates fat storage and all of that sort of stuff as well. So if the body's not listening to that, what happens is blood sugar levels tend to rise, fat metabolism and stuff gets a little bit skewed, where we tend to store rather than burn, and weight gain results. And then, as this goes on, we also end up with more of the other metabolic conditions like hypertension and cholesterol imbalance and those sorts of things as well. So really, when we're looking at PCOS and understanding that it's about male hormones, and the male hormones are high because of most likely insulin in most cases, and we can kind of go through the checklist of, which may be the driver for you, but the most common one is insulin resistance. It kind of begs the question of, well, what do we do then? So I want to give you a couple of tools here. If you have been diagnosed with PCOS, a little bit of a checklist to go through to hopefully work out where you fall in this and what might be your best options as far as treatment is concerned from there. So first and foremost is check if you actually have PCOS, because while PCOS is one of the most commonly diagnosed hormonal imbalances for women, it's also incredibly commonly misdiagnosed because it's been diagnosed via ultrasound. So you can't diagnose PCOS with ultrasound alone, because extra follicles in the ovaries are not enough to say, yes, this person has PCOS, because they may have that and not have the high male hormones or irregular cycles that go along with that. So if you were diagnosed just by an ultrasound, you want to get that diagnosis checked, because it may not actually be the case for you at all. If in fact, though, you get some bloods done and you do have high male hormones, you do have missed and irregular periods, then the next step is start working out what's the driver for you. And so because insulin resistance is the most common driver, that's where we want to start. So I would suggest getting some extra bloods done and looking at your fasting glucose levels, your HbA1c, and your fasting insulin levels. And if those are coming back high, where there is high insulin, then we can say, look, it's most likely insulin that's driving the high androgens. So this is where we start looking to unravel the ball. Now, if insulin is the issue, I guess we come at it from that angle. It's not a quick fix. It's not as quick as, popping a contraceptive pill, but in addressing it this way, we get to address all the other symptoms of PCOS rather than just the hormonal piece. So we can really start making an impact on the weight and the cholesterol maybe, and the other things that can accrue as a result of this condition. So if you do find out that it is insulin potentially that's driving it, then there's a couple of things we can do. And these are probably, just to keep this short and sweet, because I could go into a lot of detail here. I mean, I've got some resources that I can send your way if you're interested in digging a bit deeper into this. But, 3 top things I would say if you are insulin resistant and you think, I need to get on top of this, would be we need to look at protein amount in your meals and then fiber amount. So looking at the structure of your meals as far as protein total, but also food volume in the sense of fibrous vegetables. So I'm talking about vegetables that grow above the ground. They tend to be lower glycemic, lower carbohydrate, but they come with a lot of bulk and fiber. And that bulk and fiber going through your digestive system at the same time as the protein can help to keep your blood sugar levels lower, which means insulin will stay lower, which means potentially over time you can redevelop some of that sensitivity to insulin and improve those levels. So protein and fibrous vegetables are the first part. Stress management, or looking after your stress levels. So as busy humans, and I think this is so relevant for business women and high performing women and stuff in this space where there is a lot of stress all the time, and that stuff doesn't go away. We can't just kind of say, right, no stress today, we'll turn that button off. It becomes about management and learning techniques to actually be resilient to the stress load that we have to deal with. And this is really important when it comes to PCOS because of the insulin driver, because stress is one of the bigger disruptors of blood sugar levels. So it might be that you're eating really well and you're moving really well and managing your insulin that way, but the stress is creating the issue. So this is a really key one that we work with a lot of women, is looking at how we can kind of increase that stress threshold and improve management there. The other part is about movement, and we're talking movement throughout the day on the whole. So just how much actual daily activity getting in. Are you a fidgeter like me? Are you getting in plenty of steps in your day, getting a short walk in here and there? Are you doing some strength training that's prioritizing building the metabolic machinery that allows you to utilize glucose really efficiently? So a big thing with insulin resistance is it's often the muscles that become resistant to insulin. And when we start working them, when we start contracting them, we actually can improve their sensitivity, and they become the biggest glucose sponge that we've got on our body. They become the best way to manage those glucose levels, keeping our body's insulin levels down and allowing then those male hormones and whatnot that tend to rise as a result to come down as well. So just a quick recap here, when we're thinking of the context of PCOS, the main thing is the male hormones. It's not the cysts in the ovaries. That is something that can occur with or without PCOS. It needs to be diagnosed by testing for the hormones that are truly high. And then we don't just want to treat the hormones because they're just responding to what's going on in our body. We want to treat the root cause. And around about 70% of the cases, the root cause is actually the insulin levels, which I feel like it's kind of cool to know this, because like a lot of things, it puts the power back in our own hand, because, glucose, insulin, those sorts of things, those metabolic markers in our body are driven by our diet and lifestyle choices, which is in our control. So even though it puts the responsibility back on us to deal with it, it also gives us the power back. And I think that's what's really cool about this whole piece. So if this is you, or if you know someone who this would be really useful for in just understanding this a little bit more, I've got a couple of resources for you. If you just comment blood sugar below, we can send out, I've got a training for you and a couple of resources there to give you some ideas around some protein stuff and some gut-based stuff just to help manage that insulin right from the get-go. So hopefully you learned something from this, guys. A bit of a different take on that whole PCOS discussion. It's absolutely something that can be managed really well. It's not that, medication treatment and all that is wrong. It's just that there's more to the story, which we can really be doing to make sure we're optimizing for health and balancing our weight and all that stuff in the process. So I will leave that with you. Have a brilliant day, guys. See you later.